bearings combined with pacing and timing can be an absolute killer combination when it comes to navigating. But pacing and timing are not infallible. They rely on us as human beings remembering to start and stop the stopwatch. They remember us as human beings being accurate with our pacing. They're not infallible. And in fact, even when we're trying to be mega accurate, sometimes the ground that we are covering, the ground that we are on, the terrain we are moving over, means that pacing and timing are almost worthless because our pace and timing can be so staggered and so slow. There is something else that you can use though, combined with all of those, that can help to refine and pinpoint the accuracy of where you are. Not everybody is able to use one of these, but if you've got one, it can be an absolutely deadly thing to use. You want a clue? I'm wearing it on my wrist. Hi folks, I'm Craig Taylor, and as always, a huge thanks for joining me here on my YouTube channel, the Bushcraft Padawan. Now, when I say I'm wearing it on my wrist, your natural assumption is that I'm talking about a watch, and indeed I am. This is a Suunto Core watch, but it has a feature within this that makes it more than just a watch. The feature specifically that I'm talking about and referring to in this video is an altimeter. Now, before we go any further in this video, let me explain to those of you that haven't got a clue what an altimeter is. Maybe you've heard of it, but you've never really bothered finding out more about it. What is an altimeter? An altimeter is a tool, doesn't have to be in a watch, I should add at this point, but an altimeter is a tool that allows you or tells you your altitude, your elevation, the height that you are at. Let me explain incredibly briefly. One, because I'm not a meteorologist or a scientist or anything like that, and two, it's the way that I best understand how altimeters work. Let's assume that my fist here is where I am in terms of height, that the height, the elevation is irrelevant. There is so much air above me. Air has a pressure, so there is so much air pressure above me. If I move my fist down here, if I lower my elevation, there is this much air pressure above me. The higher I get, still there, the less air pressure there is above me, the lower the air pressure. The lower I get, the more the air pressure increases, the greater the air pressure. The lower I get still, the greater the amount of air, the greater the amount of air pressure, the greater the amount of air pressure that is above me. So it all relates to the height that I am, therefore it increases the air pressure or it decreases the air pressure. The higher I get, the lower the air pressure. The lower I get, the higher the air pressure. Now, there are some caveats involved with this that I won't go into here, but they go into the detail of whether I'm ascending or descending incredibly quickly. It's down to the accuracy of your altimeter. Weather conditions can play a huge role as well. But broadly speaking, very broadly speaking, if you're a scientist, if you're a Met scientist, please don't rip me apart here, but broadly speaking, that is how an altimeter works. So why should we be interested in our altitude? Why should we be interested in tapping into what an altimeter can bring us? Well, if you use the sort of maps that I use, which are a good quality topographical maps that indicate your height using a range of things, contour lines, contour markings, spot heights, trig points, things like that. If you can be told by a tool relatively accurately what your altitude is, what your height is, and you're using a map that is accurate in terms of the way that it displays altitude and height, there's quite obviously a connection here that I can then take what this tool is telling me relatively accurately, we'll come on to that in a second, and transfer that to the map. It basically fills the gaps in terms of what my altitude is. You can determine your altitude without using an altimeter, but it's far more rough and ready in my experience. It's far more open to human error and prone to miscalculations, and it's just not as quick to do, to be perfectly honest. Now, there are a couple of really important factors to consider in my experience when using an altimeter. The first one is you've got to give it a fighting chance. You can't just expect to take this out the box, put it on your wrist, and for it to accurately know where you are and your altitude and all the rest of it. You need to give it a fighting chance. The way that I always give my altimeter a fighting chance at the beginning of the day is to figure out what my start point is. Maybe it's my house, which is just a mile or two that way. I know from looking at the map that my house sits on top of the 55-meter contour line. So I know that when I'm stood downstairs in my house, I am standing at 55 meters altitude. It's a known point. My house isn't rising. My house, I hope, isn't falling. It's a fixed point. It's a known point according to the map. So I can then plug in to my altimeter 55 meters. I can set it or reset it to 55 meters. I now know that all things being equal, talking about the caveats I mentioned earlier on, that has now been set at a baseline. It has been set at a benchmark of 55 meters. I've given myself a good starting point. Maybe I'm not starting from my house. Maybe I'm starting from a track junction somewhere. Maybe I've spent the night at a campsite. Maybe I'm staying in a youth hostel. Maybe I've just pulled up a car park at the side of the road. Find out what that altitude is by careful inspection of your map and the contour lines. That's fixed, that's known. Plug that into your altimeter at the start of the day. Give your altimeter a fighting chance of helping you out by being accurate. Once you've given your altimeter a fighting chance at the start of the day, keep giving it fighting chances. Keep updating your altimeter as the day progresses. When you are in a known and fixed point, therefore you can determine a known and fixed altitude. What do I mean by this? Well, I'm going to draw your attention to a map, and I want to show you a few features on the map that I would use over a typical route to help me keep my altimeter updated. Let's look at this point at the map then that I've circled and initialed SP for starting point. It's a prominent road and it's a track junction. The track forms a crossroads with a prominent road. And by looking at the contour lines, I know that that is at 230 meters. So if that's my starting point, if that's where I've pulled my car over at the start of the day, I know, as long as I'm accurate in where I've actually pulled my car over, I've not pulled it over at a different junction, as long as I can confirm I'm at that junction, I should set my altimeter to 230 meters. I've given it a fighting chance. I then start on my navigational route and I'm following all the normal principles and practices that I should be doing when I'm navigating. Over a period of time, I've made my way up to this track T-junction that's sat between these two, or sat in the middle of this saddle between spot height 318 and 310. I'm sat in that saddle in the middle. And if I look very closely at the contour lines, that track junction is as near as damn 290 or 290 meters. I can look down now at my altimeter. If that's reading 290 meters, I'm really happy, I'm good to go. If it's reading slightly either way, I need to consider whether the inaccuracy that it's telling me is important or not. I'll come on to that in a second. If it's way off, I can then reset my altimeter to 290 meters and set off again. Now, when I said just a second ago whether the inaccuracy, I can live with it, whether it's a big deal, what I mean by that is, if you look at the contours of your map, my contour interval on this map is 10 meters. On other maps that I use, it's 5 meters. So if this is giving me an inaccuracy of maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 meters, do I need to worry about that? The contour interval on this map is 10 meters, so I'm always going to have to some degree an element of inaccuracy because it can only be accurate to 10 meters. Does 2 or 3 meters matter? If I'm on an Ordnance Survey 1 in 25,000 map and the map sheet that I'm using has a 5 meter contour interval, does a 2 or 3 matter, a 2 or 3 error on my altimeter really matter? Personally, I think in the big scheme of things, it probably doesn't, but I'm always mindful of a small error on top of a small error on top of a small error can add up quite quickly. So whenever I am at a known point, even if it's only 1 or 2 meters out, I will reset the altimeter to be exactly in line with the altitude that the map is showing me. When I reach this Y-shaped track junction here, perhaps I now decide to take a bearing up onto Craiggarten 359. Maybe I'm just going to take a direct bearing from that track junction up there, and I'm just going to use pacing and I'm going to use timing in conjunction with my bearing to get me towards the top of that peak. Now, as I said earlier on, bearings coupled with pacing and timing can be an absolute killer combination. But it may well be that as I'm moving up this feature, up the side of this hill, it does no harm at all as my height is increasing, and it will increase quite quickly going up that slope. It does me no harm at all to be able to look down at my watch and realise that I've now moved up to the 300 metre contour line. Or I'm now saying that my altimeter is saying I'm at 306 metres, I'm at 310 metres, I'm at 317 metres. You can start to get an idea now, I hope, that if your watch, if your altimeter is giving you accurate or pretty damn accurate information as to your altitude, if you're now looking at the map and you're making your way up that slope, you can start to get a sense for where you are on that slope, how far you've covered, and how far you still have to go in order to be able to get to the top. Yes, pacing, bearings and timings will all help you gather that information and will all help you to determine that. But for me, it does no harm whatsoever to have those somewhat fallible options also backed up by the altimeter that I'm naturally wearing anyway, because it's my watch, it's part of my EDC, my everyday carry. It's not extra equipment to carry, it's not something else to buy once you've already bought the watch. It's already inherently built into the kit that I'm carrying. So personally, I think it does no harm at all if you're wearing or are considering buying a watch in the future and you can afford a watch that has an altimeter on it and you're serious about your navigation. For me, it's almost personally a no-brainer to consider getting an altimeter in your watch and finding out how and when and where you can use it accurately. There are loads of altimeters out there. Some are built into watches, some are standalone. Many are now just inherently part of GPS and sat-nav systems. But for me, the sat-nav system is something extra to buy. It's not something that I would wear day in, day out, whereas my watch, which is now showing at an altitude of 79 meters, you can see, is something that I wear day in, day out. I'm never without it, which for me gives me more opportunities to practice use it. I took a group out the other day, just a few miles from me, a group of friends, took them out for a day's navigating, and it just made me realise, because it's something that I almost use without realising it. It's not something I'm overtly conscious of. I'm conscious when I take a bearing. I'm conscious when I pace. I'm conscious when I set my watch and time a certain distance. All of the traditional navigational things, for me, I'm conscious of doing them. But I must admit, it's become almost second nature to me. When I get to a known point and I can see it on the map, I just reset my altimeter, and it is a hugely beneficial and confidence boosting backup to have in your back pocket. But remember those two things I mentioned. Give it a fighting start at the start of the day and keep giving it a fighting chance whenever you are at a 100% identifiable point, not where you think you are, but where you absolutely know you are. Once you're there, determine the altitude, check your watch, reset it and tweak the adjustment if necessary, because they can be affected by things like steep ascents, descents and significant changes in the weather. Thanks as always for watching, folks. Hopefully this has given you something to think about. If you're thinking about buying an altimeter, maybe this has helped push you over the line. If you're not, if you're thinking about buying a new watch, an outdoorsy type watch, maybe it's giving you something to think about. And even if you're not thinking about an altimeter, maybe it's just pressed home the importance of recognising and being able to determine your altitude, your height, and just how important at times that can be. Thank you as always for watching, folks. Coming up on the screen right now are a couple of my more recent navigation videos that I have recorded. Why not check those out? And I look forward to seeing you in my next video very, very soon. Thanks. Cheers.